Hello, I am Shane Brinkman-Davis-Delamore, and this is Code and Optimism, a show where we explore how to solve problems faster with software. This week, we're going to be talking more about the advent of generative AI, but we're going to be talking about this at the higher level. This week, it's more about the optimism than the code. We're going to be talking a bit about how new technology, as it improves our productivity, impacts the marketplace, how it impacts people's jobs, all of those sorts of things. Because every time a new technology comes out that radically improves our productivity, people start getting worried about job loss. And further, there's sort of a second level where people also start to speculate, is there going to be a point in the future where there will be no jobs or much less jobs, and a lot of people will not have jobs? And I'm here to say that based on a logical argument, which I'm going to give you, I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think that has always been wrong in the past with every major advancement. You know, in the early 1900s, 90% of the US was working on farms. Now 1% of the US is working on farms. And same thing with every other major productivity technology in the past 400 years. It seemed like it might have been a big deal. It was a big deal, but the market changed. So let's talk a bit about that. So I'm going to be emphasizing sort of three main concepts as I explore this. There's going to be the concept of demand, there's going to be the concept of productivity, and the concept of imagination. So first, let's start. The usual argument goes something like this. Say we've got a new machine one machine can produce the same amount that 10 people could have produced. And maybe that machine requires one person to operate. So with one person, you can now produce what you could have done with 10 people. Let's use that as our example. And again, I'm sort of using this abstract example, but this is going to be driving our conversation towards generative AI. I promise we'll be getting back to that in a more focused way in future episodes, but I want to sort of start at the top level and then work our way down. So say that we've got this machine that basically makes us 10x more productive at building a widget. And when that happens, usually the fear goes something like this, that, well, we only need one person where we needed 10 before. 9 out of 10 people are going to lose their job. Panic, end of the world, disaster. And that's pretty much how these arguments go. And I call these arguments the Luddite fallacies, because Luddites was kind of the original anti-technology, a little bit of a myth. That's not actually, if you look up what actually the Luddites did, it's a little bit just off from that. But it was close enough. They didn't like how the new machines were encroaching on their jobs. And ever since, we now kind of use this term, Luddites, to refer to people who are sort of anti-technological productivity progress. So let's explore this a little bit. So here's the first real problem. And we're going to be talking about it from the productivity angle. So first of all, what's happening when we got this new machine that can do with one person what we could have done before with 10? Well, what's happened is we have now made it much easier to do that work. It's now easy. We found the easier way. It costs less money. It costs less time to produce these goods. And, you know, if the cost is purely labor and the cost of the machine is small, which eventually this does sort of come in this direction, well, let's just say it costs 1/10 as much as it did before to produce these widgets. In reality, even if you have a 10x improvement in the labor to machine ratio, you're still going to not have a full 10x decrease in cost because the inputs are probably the same, and the machine has capital expenditures, and there's all these other things. But for the simplicity of this argument, we're just going to say a 10x reduction in cost. In a competitive market, which is, again, assuming there isn't like a patent or something else that gives that one company exclusive rights to this new technology, the competition within the market will drive the price of the product down to the marginal cost. And the company will make a little bit of profit after this new capability, but most of the price savings will get passed on to the customer, whether it be another business or consumers. And so when we're getting more productive, the benefits get shared outside of the company. It isn't just the company is going to reap all the rewards, because they can't, because company A would love to reap all those rewards, but company B just down the street can undercut them by 10%. And then companies are like, all right, well, I'll undercut you by 10%. And they can keep doing that until they get to the point where they are just charging the small amount of profit that they can charge on top of the raw resources the labor costs, et cetera, et cetera. And the results are the people buying those goods are the ones that really reap the real rewards from this huge productivity gain. They get to save a ton of money on whatever they're spending before. So that say quality shoes used to cost $100 and now they cost $10. And again, I'm oversimplifying this. It's not going to be a 10x savings right off the bat, but whatever that savings is, a lot of it's going to get passed. And this won't happen instantaneously. It takes a little while for competition to turn through. There's other abstracts, but in general, this is where things will trend to over time. And so those people, say they're buying shoes, maybe they're buying $100 shoes twice a year. Maybe that's cheap. Maybe it's $1,000 shoes if you're a sneaker fan. But you then have that extra money to spend elsewhere. And so increasing productivity has made us more able to generate wealth. These now consumers in this scenario have extra money that they didn't have before to spend on other things. If it's another business that's buying the output widgets, that business now all of a sudden can invest that extra capital elsewhere to expand their business more, or they may end up just in turn passing that down to their customers, the decreased cost. The results are is when you have a massive change, and if this industry was a non-trivial chunk of the overall GDP, of the overall marketplace, if we have a 10x change in cost, that's going to ripple throughout the entire economy. The entire economy is going to change because of this productivity change. And that's a bit of the problem with the Luddite fallacy of this thing only needs 9 people where there would have been 1. There's now only needs 1 where there would have been previously 10. So we've known people have lost their jobs. Panic. Because it doesn't think about the next steps. It doesn't follow that really critical economic question. And really, this is the economic question. This is how you think like an economist. You ask, and then what? And then what happens? What happens after that? What happens after that? What happens after that? Because the economy is a dynamic, responsive system. So that's productivity. And keep in mind, nothing else. Productivity means we've now figured out how to make this way easier. What used to be a really hard thing to make is now easy. We're not going to go back and make it hard again. Except for there will be a small amount of people who like it from an artisan standpoint. They will like doing it the old hard way, either for the challenge of it, for the hobby of it, or for sort of the authenticity of it. And there will be a small marketplace that will be willing to pay 10x the cost for those goods that were handmade, that were made in the old fashion, old style. In fact, I would speculate, I don't know if this is true. I do know that it's generally proven true that all technologies throughout history are all still being produced and all being used. So horseshoes, horse and buggy, like any technology throughout history is still, so there's someone out there still making it. I suspect that pretty much any job that has ever existed in history, there's still someone who's doing it as a hobbyist, as an artisan. There's still an angle there in terms of a sort of a cultural heritage angle. But now we get to the next concept, which is demand. So what happens when the widget goes, when we got a 10x difference in labor costs for building a widget? The real question is, will the world continue to buy exactly the same amount of widgets as it did before? In which case, the demand for that widget has stayed the same. And in which case, we will only need not 1 out of every 10 people that did that part of the production before in this company. So in that case, it's certainly true that within that industry, 9 out of 10 people doing that job are going to have to find another job, right? And we'll talk a bit more of that. And I want to be empathetic to the people in that position because that can happen, that does happen. I do think as a society, we need to figure out ways to help those people retrain, retool, figure out how to move to the next job. Those people are the ones that are legit impacted. But that isn't always the scenario. That's the most extreme scenario. It's entirely possible that the demand for that product was capped by its price. That people would like to have more of that product, but given the price point it was at, there was an equilibrium met where people were like, well, that's about how much I can afford. That's about how much makes sense. It doesn't really make sense to spend more because they're too expensive. And if they're suddenly 1/10 the price, then demand will almost always go up at least a little bit, and it might go all the way up. It might go all the way up to the point where all 10 of those people are still needed, and they're going to operate 10 of those machines, and we're going to produce 10 times as much stuff as we did before. That's entirely possible. It's entirely possible it'll go above that. And that's one of the ways that companies utilizing this technology can actually end up really benefiting, and that they could end up growing considerably because they can offer the same product for a much lower price rate, or a higher quality product still at a discount price rate. All kinds of things happen because they're producing things more efficiently, and they can deliver more value per dollar to their customers. So demand can either stay the same, or it can go all the way up and match the proportionally compared to our new productivity. It can go bigger. But here's my point. Even if it stayed exactly the same in terms of the number of units the world needs, again, that is saving a huge amount of money for the downstream customers. And those customers now have this extra scalpel that they're going to spend out in the economy. And what that will do is that will shift demand to other segments of the economy. Now people will spend that money elsewhere where they were not spending it there before. Further, with this new technology, there's almost surely going to be new opportunities for new segments of the economy to be created with entrepreneurial effort. And so this leads me to the important point, which is that although demand within a specific product may be limited, although it may not, it typically will have some limit at some point, but it may be way ahead of where we're already at. So we might scale up to it, and our productivity still will not keep up. And spoiler alert, I think that's what's going to be the scenario for generative AI. I think that certainly for software, I'm going to be curious to explore the artistic case, but certainly for software case, writing software, my belief is that if generative AI makes us 10 times more productive, then we're going to need all the programmers we have and more still, because there's so much software to write, because all problems can be solved with enough knowledge, and all knowledge is ultimately what software is about. And you have heard this on the show before. So, rolling back, that's within one product category. But across all product categories, I'm going to suggest, and I believe this to be true, that demand is unbounded. Across the entire market, demand is unbounded. So even if a specific product, maybe it's rubber ducks, maybe there's a certain amount of rubber ducks that the world really wants right now, and even if you make them a dime a duck, people are not going to buy any more rubber ducks. In fact, you can probably buy rubber ducks a dime a duck, it comes to think of it at this point. But across all industries, demand is going to be always unbounded, in that we're always going to need everybody available working in order to supply the demand. And here's why. It's a really simple argument. Everybody wants to be a bajillionaire. Everybody would love to be a billionaire. Everybody would love to be a trillionaire. Everybody would love to basically improve their current situation better. Everybody would like to have a bit more. And because of that, they're going to be out there as a consumer, as a purchaser of goods and services, looking for ways that they can exchange their capital for benefits in order to become a more wealthy individual in the broader society. And if demand is unbounded, that means that demand will be limited. Our ability to supply an infinite demand will always be limited by our current technological level multiplied by basically our people. Our technology level multiplied by our people is going to be the amount of stuff we can produce at any given time. And so if you're trying to hit a near infinite target with a finite amount of people and a finite amount of technology, every person who wants to work will have an opportunity to work if they look enough to see where they can be productive in society. So even if we get 10 times better at writing software, 100 times better at writing software, 100 times better at building art, at creating art, visual art, storytelling, whatever else, we are going to find a demand that drives that. And I think that that's fairly airtight. I think that is, again, I'm sort of setting aside the case for artificial general intelligence. I think there is an optimistic story to be told there too. But I think that this current scenario, short of AGI, will always have this scenario for sure where demand is basically unbounded. So that's the demand story. Now I want to shift to the last one, which is imagination. So again, the general fallacy is that you see that if you assume the demand is static, that the demand is not changing, then all of a sudden if we can produce this thing 10 times more efficient, then we only need 1/10 the people. 9 out of every 10 people are out of job. Panic in the streets. That assumption, again, is this one-step thinking. It does not think about the step after that or the step after that. And largely speaking, that is a failure of imagination. I don't want to... people who are afraid of these things, I don't want to insult them by calling them a failure in this scenario. So if you're hearing that, I want to say that in a very specific way. Imagining the future is hard, particularly when you're going through a radical change in technology level. A radical change in productivity will result in a radical new economy. And it's been true across history. It's been very hard for people to predict where the market is going to go through this transition. So it's natural to have a failure of imagination in looking forward in terms of what might happen through a radical change in the economy. And I've got some guesses where things are going to go, but I expect to fail on this too. But what I want to say is that we should all assume our imaginations are failing, myself included, that we are not going to be able to adequately imagine what's going to happen on the other side of the economy. But we need to remember these core things, like demand is unbounded, and that even though technology is going to make us way better at producing things, it's not going to make us literally infinitely better. It will make us some finite amount better, but it will not make us infinitely better. And once we hit that finite amount, there's still going to be constraints on production. And those constraints are not going to ever keep up with the unbounded demand. And therefore, we will always have demand for a fully engaged populace. So imagination is the key here. And imagination is something that you can practice. It's something you can get better at. And it's something that you can work on to see what is that step beyond 9 out of 10 people are not going to have a job now. Well, we already know, as I've already been discussing, that demand is going to shift and change. That's going to impact how this is all going to work. We know that in turn is going to drive demand for other segments of the market are going to get a huge demand boost they didn't expect. That's going to drive demand for brand new markets that were never possible before. Those ones I'm particularly interested in, but those are the hardest ones to predict. I think it's an exciting thing to be here when things may become more productive. So those are the 3 things I want to leave you with. That aspect that productivity means we are now able to make things much more cost effectively, much easier. We found an easier way to do something, and that is good. That means that we can solve humanity's problems. We can make our lives better, easier. That's good. But solving problems always creates new problems. And there will always be an unbounded amount of extra work that needs to be done because of the unbounded demand. Demand is unbounded. That's the second thing. And the third and final thing is imagination. That what we need to do is practice our imagination to imagine what happens next. What happens after we start employing these 10x machines? What happens to that marketplace? What happens to adjacent marketplaces? How are people's spending going to change? What new possible industries does this even make possible because of this order of magnitude change in productivity? I think that's pretty exciting. I think particularly for software engineering with these changes, and we're going to talk a lot more about these in the future episodes, I think that we have the potential of dramatically increasing our ability to solve problems with software. And that is important. Solving problems is important. That's how we make our lives better. And it is fabulous that it's going to make us better. That is my point of this whole show, is how can we solve problems faster with software? And generative AI, I think, is going to help us get there. And it may not help us in the most obvious ways. I'm going to talk about that more in the future, but it definitely will help us. I'm not entirely sure it will be a 10x improvement. It might be a 2x improvement. Some people think it's going to be a 1000x improvement. I'm not really sure where it's going to lie in that spectrum, but no matter where it lies, I am fairly confident that there's going to be demand for all the developers we can possibly get, particularly the developers. And here's my parting thought, that get good at working with the new machines, get good with the new technologies. Ultimately, the people that succeed in industries that are disrupted by technology are the ones that learn how to work with the new machines the best, because those are the ones that are going to be the people who can now produce 10 times the output of what they were able to do before. The people who resist the new technologies, who don't like them and try not to use them, they're going to become just not cost effective. It's going to cost 10 times as much for them to produce something as it is for the person who got good at using technologies. So we, as people whose jobs are now getting augmented with this acceleration technologies, it's incumbent upon us to learn how to use them as effectively as possible, to get the most out of them, to be on the cutting edge of leveraging these tools to solve problems faster. So with that, I will say thank you once again for spending your valuable time with me. Oh, I guess I will also just say, as always, this is a conversation and I don't have all the answers. I would love to have a conversation. Please send your comments down below. I'd like to have your thoughts on all these things. I am going to do one more episode after this on this sort of high level. This was sort of the economic angle. I'm going to do sort of the humanitarian angle next week. And then we're going to dive into more of the practical stuff of, first, I want to talk about generative AI in general and what it is, how it works. And there's lots of other stuff out there, so I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I'm going to talk more about what its limitations are. What are its capabilities and what are its limitations? And then we're going to talk finally about practical, pragmatic, how do we start using it in our day-to-day stuff? And that's probably going to be an ongoing conversation for the rest of the year. So with that, I will just say, remember that all problems are solvable with enough knowledge.